we're on now. All right. This is the fun part. This is the part I get to actually talk about God. And you remember Peyton? We're going to do a Peyton ads today. Peyton's still in her sleeping bag because it's Sunday and she's on Sabbath rest. And Daddy's eating into her family time. So I said she could join me today for good time, for old time's sake. And I'm going to keep it short and sweet to you today. I want to talk to you about anxiety. It's been on my mind lately. No, and that wasn't pun intentional, but you know, God gives prescriptions for anxiety in scripture, but I want to go to an ancient Near Eastern prescription, something that's 3,500 years old, right? And some might say it's the beginning of the Christian message. And you know, a lot of times you'll see Christians getting a lather over the 10 Commandments and posting the 10 Commandments in a courthouse or in a schoolhouse or something like that. And they're getting big fights over it. And I think a lot of it's unnecessary, really unnecessary, because it's not the 10 Commandments that guide us. It's really the Beatitudes. So if you want to post something, post blessed are the meek, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. But that's a subject for another day. I want to take you back to some ancient Near Eastern wisdom that we find in the book of Genesis, in the opening chapters of Genesis, that have been obscured by the food fight in Christianity over science in the Bible, which the Bible's not science, it's not history. And the devil wins when you make Genesis 1 and 2 about young earth creation or old earth creation. So I'm sorry, having said that, you lose all the beauty of the theology that's there. I want to try and recuperate some of that by talking about people who might be dealing with anxiety and how modern psychology is just catching up with Moses and Jesus and Paul. So Paul famously says in Philippians, be anxious, not for one thing, but in everything give thanks. So he's giving you his prescription in Philippians of how to deal with anxiety. And he uses the idea of gratitude and thankfulness and moderation and prayer and coming to your Father to actually have a conversation and talk to him about it, right? Elsewhere, the Lord tells us to lay our burdens on him. We do that in prayer. You know, it's not something we throw in the SUV on the weekend and go drop it off at the Goodwill. We do that in prayer. And that's where that exchange takes place. And that's where that healing can start to take place. But I want to go back to the ancient Hebrews and how what they taught us in the opening chapters of Genesis about an anxious-free life. Now, we'll always have stress in life. Everyone is born to a stressful life because we live in this universe that is going through decay and upheaval, and there's chaotic forces at work, including in our own minds and sometimes our own stomachs and so forth, our appetites. So we're always going to have stress, but anxiety is the poor reaction to stress. Stress isn't a negative thing. It's just reality. Stress, we stress test bridges, right? So doing a stress test on a bridge can actually save lives. And applying stress is something we do in the gym to be fit, to remain fit and so forth. So stress itself can be a builder of not just the body, but of the sound mind and so forth. But it's when stress is allowed into the soul and takes the reins and is not dealt with properly, it becomes anxiety, and it tends to rule and overrule common sense and peace, and it robs us of our joy and our peace. So I want to take you back. Now, this is something I'm writing, so it's going to be kind of extensive. I'm just going to give you a snippet of it today, like half of a TED Talk on it, and just point out a few references that you can explore on your own to help uncover this idea. Now, so Genesis starts with chaos. Yes, it starts with God, but it's God dealing with chaos. And chaos, we're told by Isaiah, is not something that God plans or creates. So chaos enters in somehow. We won't talk about that today, but the second law of thermodynamics, if you go on vacation for a month, you're going to come home to a dusty home. even though your home's been sealed. It's just the way things are. That's metal rusts and things decay, and that's the world we live in. So chaos has a way of taking control. Now, weeds don't need plant fertilizer, right? And that's the world we live in. Weeds need very little to grow, and they grow rapidly, and they kill other things around it. So God starts in Genesis, and there's chaos, and he starts dealing with the chaos. So one of the first things that neuroscience has led us to believe is the cluttered mind creates a cluttered soul. So if you're living in a cluttered house, if you're a hoarder, that's a mental disorder, and it keeps you in a sense of depression. And so one of the things that helps with anxiety is to start putting your life in order. And it doesn't all happen on day one. Even God takes 6 days, right? I know that was a cheap one. I'll try and keep that to a minimum. But one of the first things we see is God placing things in order, and that chaos is the real enemy, and order is a friend. And so if you're dealing with an anxious life, then you need to start putting things in order. And it doesn't have to be all at once. It can be a little at a time. But put it down in goals. Say, by the end of this week, I'd like to, if you have more than one junk drawer, if you have 7 junk drawers and they're driving you nuts and you don't even walk in that room anymore because the clutter is driving you crazy, your house is ruling you, you're not ruling your house. And so just say, okay, I'm going to do 1 drawer this week. Right? That's it. And I'm going to take a half hour a day to devote toward this. Now, I'm not telling you this to be Marie Kondo. I want to talk to you about your soul, not your laundry room. So, but I'm using that as an analogy. Marie Kondo says, if it doesn't spark joy, get rid of it. Well, that's true until you get to relationships, because your husband might not spark joy right now. And I wouldn't say just get rid of him. I'm saying there's a way you can help heal that. But certainly, if it's things that aren't sparking joy, we can deal differently with them than people. So the first thing you see is order. My daughter still prays. Her opening prayer is, God, thank you for all you've provided and all you've divided. Because the Bible starts with a series of divisions. And God is giving man a series of divisions to show him unity within diversity can exist in harmony without cacophony and chaos, right? And so he begins setting things in order, and that's a beautiful thing. The second thing about Genesis that we learn is nature is an overcomer of anxiety. Being about nature, being in nature, around trees, around animals. I've met a lot of miserable people in my time as a pastor. Former pastor now, but as a pastor, somebody who's counseled for years, you meet a lot of miserable people, and they all have, although they have different issues, they all have predictable tendencies, and so some of the things I'm commenting on, you could see people who don't have any connection with animals oftentimes are very miserable people, because God has given us animals as something that will touch our soul, something that's very to bring us intimacy and a closeness to his creation. And he's given us trees. This is something Tolkien realized and C.S. Lewis realized, and they would take walks. So if you're feeling anxious, the first thing I would say to you is to set apart some time every day to walk in nature, not the mall. Now, if you're in Chicago right now and it's -2, all right, walk in the mall. But try and be out in nature. It's a gift to God. It was the first gift, the first couple, right? And it's a garden. I would say gardening can be an artistic environment where you can flourish, not just body, but soul. And it doesn't matter if you grow vegetables or flowers. You have to keep order, and you're fighting against the adversary of chaos. And there's a certain fulfillment in it, in the care and in the result, in the fulfillment of a beautiful rose or of fresh tomatoes, and battling the rabbits. and that kind of thing. But if you look at Genesis and you say, what can I glean from the early chapters of Genesis about what God was giving to mankind that was to be a benefit to his flourishing before God says, take all this and have dominion. And if you look at Genesis, God is first presented to us as a creator, as an artist. And the poem of Genesis is basically telling us that God approaches his canvas every day and something new appears on that canvas. And then at the end of the day, the morning and the evening, he stands back and he admires it. Like Bob Ross. Bob Ross can help you deal with your anxiety with his little happy trees, and smacking that brush around is helpful too. But so God was the first Bob Ross, and he'd put a little more clarity into his creation, step back and say it was good. And there's a fulfillment in that. So the arts are another place you find, not just in Genesis 1 and 2, but elsewhere, where God's first people create instruments. And so not just in the consuming of music, but in the creation of music, you can find the rest of the soul. David played for Saul and it eased his soul. It was a help. And so a lot of things we're seeing now in modern psychology, we're seeing art therapy. Well, art therapy began in Genesis. The ancient Near Eastern Hebrews, the Horite Hebrews, knew all about art therapy, right? Winston Churchill took up painting after the war, or toward the end of the war, and continued after the war as part of therapy in the 40s. And I would recommend that more than 12 cigars a day. So, and a bottle of sherry, which he also took up. But so art is something. Marc Chagall said, we should never go to bed. Not one day should pass and we should retire for the evening without considering something beautiful. And when he said consider, he meant admiring something beautiful. So when you go to bed, don't think about your bills or something awful. Consider something beautiful, whether it's a passage of poetry, whether it's a beautiful painting, whether it's a piece of music, whether it's your children asleep in their bed. We should rest at night having considered and admired something beautiful, and maybe actually closing in prayer with gratitude to God for that beauty. So God is at first an artist in the garden, and he creates all these things, and he puts man in contact with not just animals, but plants, and he puts him in a garden. And so these things, if you're having an anxious life, consider planting a garden. Now, your garden could be something as simple as a styrofoam cup in your apartment in New York City with a few seeds that would remind you of when you were a kid, right? And your mom gave you a bag of seeds, and the excitement over you maybe putting too much water in it first and having to start again, but the excitement over caring for that cup and putting water in every other day. And one day, all of a sudden, you saw a little green prod poking through the brown dirt, and how excited you got. And you ran, you got your mom and dad, and you said, look, and you brought the cup. And then once the growth started, it went pretty quick, right? That could bring joy. Even the styrofoam cup. If you have more room, plant more room, but have a patch of ground that you can love, that has become sacred to you, even if it's a small patch of ground. The creation of a journal. Jews wrote. They're the best storytellers. And I don't say that trying to be a racist. It's just true. I know different populations in different places of the world have propensities to different blessings. And I will say this 1,000 times, and it's hard to disprove this. The British do great rock and roll. The British invasion, if you want to talk about great rock and roll, I'm sorry, but the British bands put us to shame. If you want to talk about great songwriters, though, they're all Jewish. Great comedians, they're Jewish. Why? Because Jewish people tell great stories, and the Bible is filled with great stories told by Jews. And so telling stories, the sharing of stories, the hearing of stories, living life in narrative right? There's a reason that right now, even though Hollywood, with all its technology and all the blessings that technology has brought to Hollywood, and even the capacity of great storytellers, it's feeling a lag in creativity right now. And it's not because there's not great storytellers out there. It's because the people who are signing the checks don't have any creativity. They're all about business and merchandise and what'll sell on Amazon. So, but there's a reason that superhero movies are doing great, right? Because that's narrative and that's stories that we've always loved, whether we meet them in ancient Near Eastern literature, in Greek mythology, or in the Marvel DC universe. And so here, telling stories, listening to stories, reading, watching movies, quality movies. These are all good things that do help with anxiety. They're not masks. They're actually things to help keep the soul stable and to feed the soul, because we have an appetite, not just for entertainment, but for education and wisdom, the gleaning of wisdom and beauty, the pursuit of the truth, the pursuit of good, and the pursuit of beauty is the greatest prescription. It is the greatest medicine, right, for the soul. If you're in a constant pursuit of the true, the beautiful, and the good, you really aren't going to have a lot of sleepless nights, because your life will be filled with awe and wonder and gratitude. It's just true. So cultivate the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I say those three have to come together, because if you just pursue the truth, you might do it in the wrong places. There's a lot of truth in the news, and there's a lot of lies in the news, but that's not going to bring you joy, right? There's a lot of truth about yourself that isn't going to bring you joy. And this is why Paul said, think on these things, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is honorable, whatever is beautiful. See, this is Paul's prescription in Philippians. But back to Genesis and the prescription in Genesis. These are practical things you can do. Take up a musical instrument. The ukulele is easy to learn. And you might think you're not a musician. Everyone is a musician. Everyone's soul can sing. Now, you might not be a singer, but you can learn something. If you feel that you can't play an instrument, start by listening to music. And going out and seeing live music, which is a whole different flavor, right? It gives you a whole appreciation for something else. But if you get to a place where you have the courage, you could do it alone with a bunch of YouTube how-to videos. Grab an instrument and learn to play simple songs. Just learn one or two songs that you love. It'll bring you joy. You get home from a hard day's work and you pick up the ukulele. Do it. Maybe you join with a friend. So what can we learn? What else can we learn from the early chapters of Genesis? God gave us a Sabbath. He gave us a day where we weren't supposed to work. Now, he did give us 6 days to work. Believe it or not, in the Garden of Eden, Adam was given a job. Work, employment, fruitful employment can bring you fulfillment and joy. Now, we can overdo everything. Evil is just bending good. It doesn't exist by itself. Because God existed before his creation and before evil. Evil is the corruption of the good. It's not something that's the opposite of the good. It's the corruption of the good. And so we could corrupt sex, and that could become evil. We could corrupt work, and that could, become an idol. We could corrupt religion and faith, even Christianity, and that can become an idol. So we have to be careful there. But God gave us 6 days. He gave us this formula, work 6 days, take care of your family. Paul says the person who doesn't take care of his family is worse than an infidel. So the secret, one of the secrets of dealing with anxiety is get to work. Now, some men who lose their jobs dive into a depression, deep depression, because, a lot of our self-worth depends on whether we can take care of our family, whether we can succeed in the marketplace and that kind of thing. And when we're not, there's an environment where we could really lose ourselves. And so what is that? What if you can't work? What if you can't work 6 days a week because there is no work? Volunteer. That might even get you a job, by the way, but volunteer. This is another key in Genesis, helping others. helping others is a key to mental health. And there is a fulfillment in giving yourself to another and not expecting anything in return. So you can volunteer at a shelter. And there's plenty of places in your neighborhood. And the best thing to do is not to write a check for something 3,000 miles away. I'm not saying don't do that. But the best charity is the one on your block. Is there a widow on your block? Are there orphans? Is there a single mother that might need help? Is there a family whose husband is deployed in the military? Can cut their grass, right? I mean, don't be creepy about it. Get their permission and so forth. Or if you know them in church or something, don't be creepy about it. Don't just show up. But if you're out of work, do something for somebody and don't expect anything in return. And even if you are working, make time for that. Now, also make time for rest. We are to rest. We are mortal beings. Rest is God's way of saying, stay humble because you're not God. You need to take care of yourself, and rest is part of it. Now, one of the great things about keeping a Sabbath, now I know a lot of Christians get bent out of shape about it, and they say the Lord is our Sabbath, and they're some of the most miserable people I've ever met because they have the right answer to, we're not under the Jewish law, and so they don't keep a Sabbath, but they're miserable because they don't have any rest. They don't have any real rest. They just have the Sunday school answer for rest. And they never take time to do their own thinking. They let other people do all their thinking for them. They, watch sermons or read other people's books, and they never are alone with God, ever. And so they let other people do their thinking for them, and that's not being what God says is a virtuous or a noble workman that needeth not be ashamed. He wants you with your spade to dig your own field, to furrow your own field, and to do your own thinking. God gave you your own mind. He didn't give you somebody else's mind to do your thinking for you. And that's where we get into a lot of trouble, when we get tribal, when we allow other people to think for us. Be grateful for other people's thinking and take it in and measure it and weigh it. And if it's great, be thankful to it and express your gratitude to them and to God for the help that they've presented in your life. But a lot of times we get help from certain people or certain groups, and then we think that they're right all of the time. And we just accept everything they say. And we're not. I mean, one of the first things we're going to realize when we get to heaven is how wrong we were and how dogmatic we were in our wrongness. So humility is another thing that prevents anxiety, because as I said in a previous session, anxiety's twin is control. And people who feel great anxiety oftentimes are control freaks or perfectionists who can't get the world the way they want it and then seep into anxiety. And so one of the first things that you can do to understand the nature of why anxiety comes is to wrap your mind, or maybe to do a systematic audit of your relationship to control. And to realize, as Epictetus and as St. Paul and others have said, that the things that are outside of your control, like the tornado that's going to hit next year, or the national economy, you shouldn't spend a second worrying about things that are outside your control. All your time should be invested on the things that are within your control and how to respond to things that are within and without your control, right? Because that's where we come in. So I would encourage you this. I'm going to stop here because there's so much more, but I would encourage you this week to review the early chapters of Genesis. If you're dealing with anxiety right now, or if you're a friend of somebody who's going through anxiety and you want to learn how you can help them, don't buy somebody else's book. Here's where you could start. You could start with scripture, and you could read the Beatitudes, right? Because a famous psychologist in the 70s said something that was very controversial at the time. He said, all of modern psychology, there's a famous saying by a philosopher that hat-tipped Plato. He said pretty much all of Western philosophy are but the footnotes in Plato, Plato's scribbles. And adopting that syllogism, a modern psychologist in the 70s said, virtually all of the advances we've had in modern psychology are but the footnotes to the Sermon on the Mount. So if you really want to deal with anxiety, I'd say read Philippians. Yes, you can read what Paul says about it there, but I would say try and live the Beatitudes. And when I say try, I don't mean grievously. I don't mean suck the joy out of your life, keeping short accounts. I mean appreciate the wisdom that Jesus delivered there, and adopt it as a lifestyle, and pray about it and meditate on it. But here you can come for practical things, come to Genesis and look at what God planted in the garden. A garden was important, right? Relationship to the earth and to animals was important. But God gave all that to Adam, and then he said, this is good, this is good, this is good. The first thing that God found wasn't good, loneliness. He found man to be alone, even in his, it wasn't a perfect creation, it was a good creation, but even in his good creation, and he said, this isn't good that man is alone, and he gave Eve to Adam. So I'm not just talking about sexual relationships here, folks. I'm talking because my wife isn't just my love in the Eros fashion. She's also my best friend. I love Wendy with all four natural loves, with all of the natural loves. She's my best friend, so there's, philia. She's my family, so there's storge, right? Of course, there's Eros. And although agape is not a natural love, it's a supernatural love, I love her unconditionally, or at least in the power of the Spirit. On my best days, I do. So having said all that, look back on Genesis and glean what was happening there. Order was coming out of chaos, but it was purposefully coming out of chaos. It just didn't happen. God had a schedule, he had a calendar, and he did a little each day, and he rested on the seventh day. We need to incorporate that. God didn't rest because he needed it. He rested to give us an example, right? So work plays a role in it. The appreciation of art, music, the making of art, the telling of stories, the receiving of stories, the companion of our fellow man, and the giving ourselves for another person. All these things are wrapped up in the early chapters of Genesis, and it'll teach us how to bring harmony out of chaos and how to appreciate true diversity, unity within diversity. And this will allow you to flourish in the soul, and you will become an oasis. We live in an America right now that's a wasteland. The suicide rate is rising greatly. People are feeling more disconnected, even though the internet connects people from afar, but not right next to you. Ooh, that's beautiful. So I'm about to go to Peyton for Peyton ads, and she could show you what she's been drawing this whole time. But I would encourage you to glean what the ancient Hebrews had to teach us in the early chapters of Genesis. And then, by the way, by the time you get to chapter 3, you see what disrupts it and what comes to, what lurks that would destroy a family, a community, a church, a nation, a people, and what would establish alienation between God and people, which is always on man's side. God never closes his door. If God was staying in the hotel room next to us and we had adjoining rooms, we'd find when we finally open unpadlock our door and opened it, his door is already open. God's door is always open. He's left the light on, as in Luke 15. He's on the roof waiting for our return. And we might, write dark poetry about the door that's locked in between us. But as C.S. Lewis found out and Grief observed, it's locked from our side. It's padlocked from our side. And one day when we finally peel back the locks and open the door, we'll see it's been open on his side the whole time. So I'll leave you with that. And we'll come back to this in the future. I want to talk to you about it because I know anxiety is really a powerful arrow in the adversary's quiver. And many, believe it or not only many Americans, but many followers of Christ find themselves in deep anxiety and they don't know what to do. Now, seeing a therapist or getting on some kind of medication is not outside the bounds of Scripture. Don't let a pastor tell you that's like saying you don't need to treat your appendicitis. So if you have a good therapist, consider consulting a good therapist. If you're in a deep depression, you because we could be chemically imbalanced because we live in an imperfect world. I'm not saying, throw away your pills, but I am saying there is wisdom that we can glean from scripture, both the Old and the New Testament. And it's not the 10 Commandments that's going to help you deal with your anxiety. It's the Beatitudes. It's what we find in Philippians. It's allowing time to lament. Lamentations are okay. Crying is okay. Yelling at God is approved by the Bible, by God himself. God loves a good argument. If you don't believe me, some of his best friends argued with him. Abraham, Moses, David, I could keep going. Jacob wrestled with him. God doesn't mind that. Psalm 88 is a psalm that is shaking its fist at God, and you'd think it was written by Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. God doesn't mind that. Modern Christianity does. They think that you can't do that, but God put it in his psalm book. In his book of songs, you find that kind of thing. And it's helpful sometimes to vent to God and to allow him to speak back to us. So at this point, Peyton, do you have anything for us? The garden motif. Is that the tree of life, or is that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? No. Oh, that's the dangerous one. Don't eat of that one, folks, or we'll be thrown out of the garden. But Peyton, you have anything you want to say before we sign off? Hi. See you later, folks. Thanks for watching today.